I always begin this story with a certain feeling. When we speak about Germany's defeat in the First World War, we are not merely addressing military maps or diplomatic telegrams. We are touching something far deeper, the internal mechanics of history itself. This was a defeat that matured not on the battlefield, but inside the society, within political corridors, in the dim halls of factories, and in the silence of exhausted households. It is the story of a nation that could have won, that at the beginning possessed everything required for victory, but made one fatal mistake. It confused strength with invulnerability and early success with inevitability. In 1914, the German Empire seemed like the engine of the future. It was young, ambitious, technologically explosive. Its army was not made of romantic cavalrymen from the old world, but of engineers in greatcoats, children of the machine age. Germany was building zeppelins, power plants, optical devices. It radiated innovation. The streets of Berlin looked like an organism breathing the future. Almost every family believed in a quick victory, and almost every politician believed in the glitter of a war they imagined would be short. But in that glitter lay the first crack in the imperial myth. Germany, intoxicated by its own power, underestimated something that cannot be measured in tons of steel or kilometers of railway: endurance, time, and the resources of a world willing to unite against it. It entered the war convinced it could break France in 6 weeks, and instead unlocked a nightmare that lasted 4 years and shattered Europe itself. The early months still felt triumphant. German forces moved quickly, discipline glowed, logistics functioned with the precision of a watchmaker. Yet hidden beneath that precision was the first unwelcome shadow. Germany possessed plenty of tactical brilliance, but very little strategic adaptability. It knew how to win battles, but not how to survive a long war. The generals believed in rapid solutions because they had no plan and no tools for slow ones. History is not merely a sequence of events. It is the way societies react when placed under pressure. And under pressure, Germany behaved as though it still lived in the 19th century. It counted on steel rather than oil, on discipline rather than economic resilience, on fear rather than diplomacy. It failed to grasp that war in the 20th century was no longer a duel between armies, but a competition of industries, resources, and national nervous systems. In the early months, this was almost invisible, but by 1915, the first great rupture appeared. The economy began to suffocate. Germany, encircled by a naval blockade, became an army without food, a factory without raw materials, a nation without access to global trade. And although this became undeniable only years later, the empire's fate was already sealed. Because wars are not won by the strongest side in August, they are won by the side that does not break in November. And from the middle of the war, a quiet but unmistakable truth emerged inside Germany. The army was holding, but society was not. Letters from the front increasingly spoke not of heroism, but of exhaustion. Soldiers wrote, "We hold the line, but we no longer understand why." This was not rebellion, it was a symptom. An army is invincible only as long as its soldiers know the purpose behind their suffering. When that purpose vanishes, even the sound of gunfire becomes muted. Cities began to feel hunger, at first light, then noticeable, then humiliating. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Markets sold substitutes that would not have fed livestock a few years ago. Mothers wrote in their diaries, "We have learned to cook meals without meals." When families eat dishes made from beet pulp and potato flour, war ceases to be patriotic duty and becomes hardship. And here Germany made its second fatal mistake. It ignored its own people's suffering. A state that forces its population to starve so the army can fight must be either morally exceptional or profoundly blind. In Germany's case, it was blindness. The empire believed discipline could endure anything, but even the strongest discipline has a limit. It ends at the empty stomach. But Germany's defeat was not merely the result of economic decline. It was the result of misreading the age itself. Germany still thought in 19th century categories in a world that had already entered the 20th. It believed that military strength defined national power. But the truth was reversed. National power defined military strength. And a state corroded by hunger, fatigue, distrust, and blockade could not sustain a brilliant front line indefinitely. The harder Germany pushed on the front, the faster the seams tore at home. This was not a defeat in battle, it was a defeat in duration. And the first great lesson of this story is simple. Germany did not lose because it was weak, it lost because its strength was not long enough. It was in this moment, at the intersection of pressure and exhaustion, at the boundary between ambition and collapse, that the true story of Germany's defeat began, not in the trenches, but in the quiet apartments where lamps went dark because coal had run out, not in military headquarters, but in factory floors where machines stopped because there was no metal, not in the speeches of generals, but in the hearts of people who no longer believed the state could protect them. This is how Germany's path to defeat begins, not as a journey from strength to weakness, but from confidence to depletion. And from this first, almost invisible crack in the imperial armor, the rest of the story unfolds. If the first cracks in Germany's armor appeared quietly, almost tenderly, then the following years widened them into fractures that could no longer be hidden. A nation that believed it had mastered war now found itself mastered by it. Germany's defeat was not a sudden downfall, it was a slow erosion, a weakening that began beneath the surface long before the world noticed. Only in retrospect does the pattern become clear. The empire did not collapse because it lacked courage, but because it misjudged the very nature of the conflict it had entered. By 1915-1916, Germany was already engaged in a war for which there was no historical precedent. Warfare had transformed into an industrial hurricane, a grinding collision of production, logistics, manpower, and endurance. The old models of victory, built on swift movement and decisive battles, were dead. What replaced them was attrition, a monstrous arithmetic in which success belonged to the side with more hands to dig trenches, more coal to fuel furnaces, more metal to shape into shells, and more stomachs that could survive another winter. Germany, for all its brilliance, entered this new era unprepared. The empire had planned for a sprint. Instead, it found itself in a marathon. And marathons are not won by those who start fastest, but by those who endure longest. In this sense, Germany's fate was sealed not at Verdun, not on the Somme, not in Flanders, but in the early decision to fight a war that its economy could not sustain indefinitely. The blockade tightened like a noose. Month after month, Germany's access to global markets narrowed until it vanished entirely. Oil became scarce, rubber disappeared, metal grew limited. Even soap became a luxury commodity. The German state responded with rationing, improvisation, and hopeful science. Ersatz products meant to replace what could no longer be imported. Ersatz rubber, ersatz fat, ersatz coffee. A society increasingly built not on abundance, but on substitutes. The material poverty of the nation became psychological poverty. In a letter from late 1916, a German civilian wrote, "We do not hunger for food alone, but for the feeling that life makes sense." Those words capture the essence of the home front. It was not starvation itself that defeated Germany. It was the prolonged intimacy with scarcity. Scarcity erodes faith. Scarcity breeds doubt. Scarcity turns patriotism brittle. Even so, Germany did not break immediately. Its armies continued to fight with extraordinary efficiency. Its generals crafted operations, Verdun most infamously, intended not merely to capture territory, but to bleed the enemy into paralysis. Falkenhayn believed the French army could be worn down until it imploded. But Verdun did not yield the outcome Germany hoped for. The French bled, yes, but they did not collapse. Instead, Verdun transformed from a battlefield into a symbol, a warning that Germany was fighting a war it could not outlast. While soldiers died in the tens of thousands, German society lost something equally critical: time. Time to rebuild, time to breathe, time to adapt. Every month the war continued, the Allies grew stronger, fed by vast British imperial resources and by the industrial awakening of the United States. Germany, locked behind the Allied blockade, relied on what it already had, and what it had was slowly disappearing. The empire faced another problem it did not anticipate: the fragmentation of its political soul. Germany was not a monolith. It was a federation dominated by Prussian militarism, governed by a Kaiser who believed in divine right, and administered by bureaucrats who lacked the tools to manage a modern, mass-mobilized population. The Reichstag could speak but could not command. The army could command but could not feed food. And the Kaiser could inspire loyalty but not food from barren fields or coal from empty mines. Within this mismatch between authority and responsibility, a new tension was born. The military leadership demanded total obedience, while the civilian leadership demanded flexibility, compromise, and the management of societal suffering. These two visions collided like tectonic plates. The result was not reform, but paralysis. In 1916, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the architects of Germany's later war effort, rose to near dictatorial power. They believed that discipline and steel could still deliver victory. They believed that by mobilizing every resource, Germany could overpower the world that arrayed itself against them. But they misunderstood the nature of total war. Total war requires total capacity, not total willpower. It requires an economy that outproduces the enemy, not generals who outshout the parliament. The Hindenburg Program of 1916 to 1917 aimed to squeeze the last drops of strength from a strained society. It did increase production, but at a cost. The intensified demands crushed workers, disrupted agriculture, weakened supply chains, and accelerated the exhaustion already spreading through the civilian population. Like a doctor treating a fever with bloodletting, the generals tried to cure strain with further strain. Meanwhile, the empire's alliances began to crumble. Austria-Hungary, already stretched thin, depended increasingly on German protection. Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire required steady support. Instead of receiving strength from its allies, Germany found itself forced to distribute strength it did not have. The Central Powers were not a coalition of equals. They were a cluster of sinking stones tied together by desperation. And still the war dragged on. The winter of 1916-1917, later called the Turnip Winter, exposed how deep the crisis had become. Potatoes failed, bread rations shrank. Children searched through frozen fields for vegetable scraps. City dwellers survived on turnip-based food substitutes so tasteless that even animals rejected them. Hunger is not merely a physiological condition, it is emotional. It corrodes the bonds between state and citizen. It encourages people to ask questions that governments at war do not want asked. At the front, the psychological burden grew heavier. The myth of quick victory was long dead. The soldiers no longer imagined themselves marching triumphantly into Paris or Moscow. They imagined themselves surviving another day, and many no longer believed they would. Diary entries reveal a painful evolution: confidence replaced by fatigue, fatigue replaced by fatalism. "Germany will not break," one soldier wrote, "but I fear we will bend until we cannot stand." He was wrong in one sense: Germany did break. But he was right in another. The breaking did not begin with mutiny. It began with bending, with stretching the emotional fibers of society until they frayed into strands too weak to carry the weight of the war. And in this climate of strain, collapse, and slow disillusionment, the most important development of all occurred: the entry of the United States. Germany understood at some level the danger of a new industrial giant joining the conflict, but it underestimated the speed with which America would transform its economy into a war machine. This was the moment the war became unwinnable. Not because American soldiers flooded the front, that would come later, but because American factories flooded the Atlantic with food, steel, fuel, engines, and supplies that Britain and France desperately needed. Germany was not fighting the Europe of 1914 anymore. It was fighting half the industrial capacity of the planet. The empire did not collapse yet, but from this moment forward, everything Germany did was an attempt to escape a future it already understood. By 1917, Germany stood in a strange place, powerful enough to keep fighting, but too exhausted to truly hope for victory. It was a nation suspended between momentum and collapse, unable to stop the war, yet unable to win it. This year, more than any other, revealed the deep structural weaknesses that made Germany's defeat inevitable. If the earlier years showed cracks, 1917 was the moment the entire edifice began to tilt. The turning point did not come from a single event, but from the cumulative pressure of forces Germany could no longer control. The empire entered the year convinced that one more push, one more bold plan could break the stalemate. But war, like history, does not bend to optimism. It bends to capacity, and by 1917, Germany's capacity had quietly evaporated. The British blockade had grown so suffocating that it reshaped daily life. Markets in Berlin and Munich became mirrors of scarcity: thin bread, watery soups, substitutes for substitutes. Housewives carried ration cards like passports to survival. Children learned the weight of hunger earlier than they learned arithmetic. Every empty shelf in a grocery store was a silent battlefield where Germany was losing not to armies, but to a world economy it could no longer reach. As the civilian population weakened, so did faith in the state. Hunger breeds cynicism. Cynicism breeds anger. Anger breeds questions about truths once considered unshakable. In village squares and factory floors, whispers replaced certainty, and those whispers carried a dangerous idea: that the war was no longer winnable. In response, German leadership doubled down with a kind of desperate brilliance. They gambled on unrestricted submarine warfare, believing that U-boats could sink enough Allied shipping to starve Britain into submission before America entered the war in force. It was a high-stakes bet, an attempt to break the deadlock by weaponizing the ocean itself. For a few months, it nearly worked. Ships burned on the horizon. British imports plummeted. Panic flashed through London. But like many German wartime strategies, the submarine campaign achieved tactical success and strategic disaster. Yes, U-boats sank ships, but they also dragged the United States fully into the conflict, transforming the war from a European inferno into a global struggle Germany could not win. This was the fatal irony of 1917. Every German move made sense in isolation, yet every move pushed the empire closer to collapse. On the front lines, the psychological burden grew heavier. Soldiers had survived Verdun, the Somme, endless barrages, poison gas, freezing winters, and brutal summers. They no longer fought for victory, they fought to avoid defeat. The trenches were no longer trenches, they were tombs temporarily masquerading as shelters. Mud swallowed legs, shells erased landmarks, rats thrived where men barely did. Letters home shifted from confident patriotism to quiet confessions. Some described the front as a world stripped of logic, where survival felt accidental and meaning dissolved. These letters were not acts of rebellion, they were snapshots of a society losing its emotional stamina. At the same time, the German High Command attempted to compensate with machinery and doctrine. New stormtrooper tactics promised breakthroughs through speed and infiltration. New artillery methods promised shock and disorientation. New training regiments promised superiority through precision. And yet, none of this addressed the deeper truth. Germany no longer had the resources to sustain a war of attrition against an expanding coalition. Britain was adapting. France, though battered by mutinies, endured. The United States was mobilizing with industrial strength no nation in Europe could match. Even Russia, though collapsing internally, tied down German divisions until its final collapse, and Russia's exit, ironically, arrived too late to save Germany. Inside the empire, political pressure mounted. The Reichstag pushed for peace negotiations. Civilians held strikes demanding food and reform. The Social Democrats sensed that the war effort was fracturing. Even the Kaiser, once a symbol of unwavering authority, appeared increasingly irrelevant. The true power now lay with Hindenburg and Ludendorff, whose military dictatorship attempted to bend the entire country around the needs of the front. But soldier and civilian alike were beginning to reach a breaking point. One of the most revealing signs was the emergence of mass strikes in early 1917. Factory workers, worn down by 12-hour shifts, hunger, and the impossible demands of the Hindenburg program, walked out in protest. These were not small demonstrations, but massive industrial stoppages that shook the empire. For the first time, Germany confronted a dangerous internal truth. Its society could no longer keep pace with the war it had unleashed. Meanwhile, on the front lines, a different shift occurred. German soldiers noticed increasing differences between themselves and the Allies. While they marched in patched uniforms, they saw fresh American supplies arriving on the Western Front. While their rations shrank, Allied stockpiles grew. While they rotated exhausted units, British and French divisions were reinforced by new men and new machines. A soldier fights differently when he senses imbalance, when he sees that the enemy becomes stronger while he becomes weaker. This recognition spreads like a shadow. It does not cause immediate collapse, but it drains the courage that once came naturally. In 1917, Germany still believed it had one last chance. That chance came on the Eastern Front. When the Russian Empire finally collapsed into revolution, Germany breathed like a man who had been underwater for too long. At last, one of the great adversaries was gone. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers could be transferred west. Vast food supplies flowed from Ukraine. Grain trains, at least temporarily, softened the hunger in German cities. But history is cruel in its timing. Russia's exit provided hope when hope already meant nothing. It gave Germany space, but not salvation. The resources gained were too small, too late, too fragile to resist the tidal wave building across the Atlantic. The final blow of 1917 was not military, it was psychological. Germany realized, often silently, that the war could not be won. The empire continued to fight because stopping felt impossible, because admitting defeat felt like abandoning the sacrifices of millions. But beneath the surface, the nation had already begun to decay. When people sense inevitable defeat yet continue forward, they do not move like soldiers marching to victory. They moved like sleepwalkers trapped in a dream they can't escape. By the time 1917 ended, Germany still held vast territories. Its armies were intact, its generals were confident, its industry still produced weapons of formidable power. And yet, the empire was dying, not from lack of strength, but from lack of future. The war had become unwinnable, and everyone, soldiers, workers, politicians, mothers, even generals, felt this truth in the quiet moments they dared to think. By the beginning of 1918, Germany was no longer fighting the same war it had entered in 1914. The uniforms were similar, the trenches familiar, the generals the same, but the essence of the conflict had transformed into something the empire was never built to withstand. Germany had become a powerful machine connected to a failing power grid. The lights still glowed, the gears still turned, but every hour drained the nation closer to darkness. And the tragedy was this: Germany did not collapse because it lacked brilliance. It collapsed because every brilliant effort came from a society already stretched beyond its limits. The year opened with a paradox. On paper, Germany had the advantage. Russia was gone from the war. The Eastern Front had vanished like a long shadow, finally lifted. More than 1 million soldiers could be redeployed westward. Vast fields of Ukrainian grain offered temporary relief to starving cities. Military planners spoke with renewed confidence. Newspapers printed editorials insisting that the war could still be won if Germany struck fast enough. That word, fast, was the empire's only remaining currency. Germany no longer had time. It had to win before America arrived in force, before Britain's industry overwhelmed it, before France recovered from its scars, before its own population lost the last fragments of endurance. Thus was born the Spring Offensive, a desperate masterpiece. It was an operation crafted for a nation running on fumes, a final gamble by leadership that understood, privately, that there would not be another chance. Hindenburg and Ludendorff envisioned a lightning strike that would shatter the Western Front before the Allied colossus became unstoppable. They sought to break the stalemate with tactics so innovative they seemed like a new language of warfare. Infiltration units, shock battalions, coordinated artillery storms that moved like a rolling curtain of iron. And for a moment, a brief, terrifying moment, it worked. German stormtroopers moved through the mist like revenants. British lines buckled. French divisions reeled. The empire advanced farther in weeks than it had in years. Generals in Berlin spoke of the final victory, as if saying it aloud might conjure it into existence. But beneath that triumph lay the realities Germany could not outrun. The Spring Offensive was a tactical marvel, fueled by strategic delusion. Every kilometer gained cost men Germany could not replace. Every village taken consumed ammunition Germany could not replenish. Every success accelerated the internal collapse instead of halting it. The offensive achieved movement, but not meaning. And the soldiers felt this contradiction. Veterans marching through captured towns saw not triumph, but emptiness. Their ranks thinning, their supply lines stretched, their bodies exhausted, their stomachs empty. A victory won by hunger is not victory, it is delay. When the offensive finally stalled, Germany found itself not ahead, but exposed. The empire had thrown its last reserves into an advance that could not break the enemy, and now the enemy was stronger than ever. American troops were arriving in numbers that transformed the Western Front into a demographic avalanche. Fresh divisions, well-fed, well-equipped, enthusiastic, unbroken by years of trench life, marched into battle with a confidence Germany had lost. In 1914, Germany had feared being surrounded. In 1918, it feared being outlasted. These were not the same fear. One was military, the other was existential. The home front, meanwhile, had reached the edge. The strikes of 1917 had not disappeared, they had merely waited. Hunger still stalked the cities. Coal shortages turned apartments into freezing tombs. Factories struggled. Bureaucracies frayed. Newspapers, once triumphant, now printed coded laments. Even the censors could no longer hide despair. There was too much of it. In Hamburg, workers walked out again. In Berlin, riots flickered like sparks in a dark forest. In Munich, radicals whispered about revolution. The edges of the empire, once held together by the gravitational pull of the Kaiserreich, began to peel away. Meanwhile, morale at the front sank into something deeper than fatigue, a kind of spiritual erosion. Soldiers wrote in their diaries that they no longer recognized the Germany they fought for. They heard about the hunger at home, the chaos in the streets, the political fractures widening like storm cracks across a frozen lake. They sensed that their sacrifices would not secure a glorious peace, but merely postpone an unavoidable reckoning. Germany's high command, however, refused to acknowledge it. Ludendorff continued issuing orders with the certainty of a man living inside a map rather than a country. But wars are not won on maps, they are won in societies. A general can command armies, he cannot command a starving population into hope. Perhaps the most symbolic moment of this era came in late 1918 when German units, still disciplined, still loyal, suddenly began surrendering in numbers that shocked even Allied commanders. These were not mutinies. These were decisions made by soldiers who understood that continuing the fight meant nothing. They were not breaking under fire. They were breaking under the weight of futility. One officer wrote, "We could still fight, but we could no longer believe." That line is the epitaph of the German war effort. The army was not defeated first. The belief was. And once belief died, every bullet, every order, every trench, every ration became part of a body already in collapse. Meanwhile, Germany's allies fell like dominoes. Bulgaria surrendered. The Ottoman Empire crumbled. Austria-Hungary, more corpse than empire, disintegrated into a map of new nations. Germany stood alone, and loneliness in war is death. In this landscape of collapse, the Kaiser was little more than a symbol of a past that no longer existed. The monarchy that had once seemed eternal now felt archaic. When sailors on the North Sea mutinied, refusing a final suicide mission, the myth of imperial obedience evaporated. Workers joined them, soldiers followed, councils emerged, flags changed, cities trembled. The empire had begun to die from within long before the enemy crossed its borders. By the autumn of 1918, there was no grand drama left. The story had become tragically predictable. Germany still had men in uniform, rifles in hand, shells in depots, but what it no longer had was the emotional and structural foundation to support them. War had become heavier than the nation. The end did not arrive like a sword. It arrived like erosion. There is a moment in every collapsing system when the outward shape still resembles stability, yet the inner structure has already dissolved. For Germany, that moment arrived in the late summer of 1918. The empire still had armies in the field, still held territory, still fielded artillery and machine guns, and yet the war was already lost. The uniforms, the flags, the command structures were all intact, but the forces that made them meaningful had evaporated. Germany was fighting with the shell of a state, not the substance of one. It is tempting to imagine defeat as a single event, a battle lost, a line broken, a surrender signed. But Germany's defeat in the First World War was not an event. It was a condition, a gradual suffocation of national capacity. And by 1918, that condition had become irreversible. The spring offensive had consumed Germany's last reserves of energy. What Ludendorff unleashed in March was not a campaign, it was the final exhalation of a nation that had burned its strength too quickly. When the offensive stalled, Germany did not merely lose initiative, it lost the ability to shape the war at all. The empire shifted from actor to reactor, from strategist to survivor. Meanwhile, the Allies had transformed. British logistics operated with a level of sophistication unimaginable in 1914. French morale, restored after the horrors of Verdun and the mutinies of 1917, steadied like a hand tightening around a rifle. And the United States, young, enormous, industrially electric, arrived like a second sunrise. American soldiers were not simply reinforcements, they were a reminder of time, the one resource Germany no longer possessed. For every German division withdrawn, there was an American division arriving. For every German factory that slowed for lack of coal, there were American factories roaring at full capacity. For every German soldier fighting his fourth year of war, there was an American soldier stepping into battle for the first time, fresh, confident, unbroken. War is not only a clash of armies, it is a clash of timelines, and Germany's timeline had run out. The 100 Days Offensive that began in August 1918 was not a single campaign. It was a relentless sequence of blows delivered by an opponent who sensed weakness. The Allies attacked along multiple fronts, never allowing Germany to recover, never granting a moment of pause. German defenses shattered not because the soldiers lacked courage, but because they were asked to do the impossible, to hold ground against armies that had more men, more food, more ammunition, more morale, and more future. In diary entries from the period, German officers wrote of watching entire companies dissolve under shellfire and then discovering there were no replacements left. Machine guns were abandoned because there was no ammunition to feed them. Trenches were held not by battalions, but by thin, trembling lines of men who had not slept in days. Meanwhile, the home front, once strained, now reached open rupture. Hunger became a political force. Exhaustion became a class identity. Despair became a language spoken fluently across every city. Strikes erupted in Berlin, Kiel, Hamburg. Not symbolic strikes, but existential ones. Movements driven by the realization that the war was no longer about victory, but about survival. Workers demanded bread, heat, and above all, an end. Their demands were not ideological, they were primal. The state responded with suppression, but repression has no effect on empty stomachs. A government can silence dissent, but it cannot silence hunger. It can control speech, but not the price of potatoes. It can command loyalty, but not hope. The situation grew so severe that even soldiers on leave reported being shocked by the poverty of their own families. Some returned to the front more frightened of the home they left behind than the enemy they faced in the trenches. In this environment, the legitimacy of German leadership began to crumble. The Kaiser, once a symbol of imperial strength, now resembled an increasingly distant figure, disconnected from the reality of his people. Ludendorff, a master of tactics, became a prisoner of his own illusions, convinced that the army could still deliver a decisive blow even as the nation imploded behind him. Civilian politicians scrambled to negotiate peace without admitting the scale of the catastrophe. But the greatest collapse was emotional. The German soldier of 1918 was not the soldier of 1914. He had marched across Belgium believing in destiny. He now stood in a wet trench believing in nothing. The Empire's defeat was not a failure of force, it was a failure of meaning. When the Allies broke through at Amiens in August, what Ludendorff famously called the Black Day of the German army, it was not because the army suddenly forgot how to fight. It was because the army faced an opponent who had recovered its strength, while Germany had exhausted its own. The German lines did not rupture from cowardice, they ruptured from inevitability. Every German retreat widened the gap between the front and the home front. Every lost village deepened the panic in Berlin. Every telegram reporting Allied gains intensified the cracks inside the state. What had been a military emergency in spring became a national implosion by autumn. And then came a blow more devastating than any Allied attack, the collapse of Germany's allies. Bulgaria surrendered first, a fracture that surprised even optimists. The Ottoman Empire followed, exhausted by years of defeat and starvation. Austria-Hungary, the empire Germany had carried on its back for 2 years, imploded in a cascade of nationalism. Czechs, Poles, Croats, Slovenes, Hungarians, each group stepped out of the imperial shadow and declared independence. Germany was alone. Alone against Britain. Alone against France. Alone against the British Empire. Alone against the United States. Alone against time. A nation can endure hardship when supported by allies, but when allies vanish, hardship becomes doom. The internal collapse intensified. Workers' councils appeared across cities. Sailors mutinied in Kiel. Revolution spread like a spark in dry wheat. The monarchy cracked. The government panicked. The streets filled with people demanding peace. At this point, the German High Command finally conceded the truth it had refused to say aloud. The war was lost. It was not a matter of courage, but mathematics. Not a matter of honor, but exhaustion. Not a matter of betrayal, but inevitability. Germany requested an armistice not because it lacked soldiers, but because it lacked the power to keep those soldiers fed, armed, supplied, and willing. The empire had reached the end of its endurance, and endurance, not bravery, not strategy, not discipline, is the true currency of modern war. Germany's defeat by late 1918 was not a collapse. It was a conclusion. A conclusion written by hunger, by blockade, by time, by industrial logic, and by the unrelenting arithmetic of a world war beyond anything the 19th century had prepared the empire to face. By the final stretch of 1918, Germany was fighting a war that no longer resembled its original aims, its original vision, or its original confidence. What remained of the empire's strength was a residue, the echo of a machine once in motion, still turning out of habit long after its fuel had been exhausted. And it is here in this hollow momentum that we see the final stage of Germany's defeat. Not collapse by force, but collapse by internal expiration. The tragic paradox of late 1918 was this. The German army was still one of the best trained forces on the continent. Its officers were experienced, its doctrine sophisticated, its units battle-hardened. And yet it could no longer act as a national army because the nation that had created it by late 1918 was unraveling beneath its feet. Germany became a giant carried on the shoulders of a shrinking child. The larger the military effort grew, the faster the supporting society buckled. The decisive stage of defeat unfolded not through grand offensives or dramatic breakthroughs, but through the erosion of 4 pillars that uphold any modern war effort: logistics, morale, political coherence, and international position. Each of these pillars cracked simultaneously. And when all 4 fail, defeat becomes not a possibility, but an inevitability. The first pillar to fail was logistics. Germany's supply system had reached a point of irreversible weakness. Coal shortages crippled factories. Railroads suffered breakdowns because locomotives had been cannibalized for parts. Food shipments arrived spoiled or diluted. Medical supplies dwindled to near nothing. The Hindenburg Program, designed to squeeze every last drop of productivity from the empire, had overstretched industry so severely that it broke the very mechanisms of production. There is an entry from a German factory inspector in 1918 that captures the moment perfectly. "We have workers, we have machines, we have orders, we have no fuel." A modern war cannot survive that contradiction. The second pillar to fail was morale, not just among soldiers, but across the entire population. Morale does not collapse with one single event. It collapses when millions of small certainties die. The certainty that one's family has enough food. The certainty that the state knows what it is doing. The certainty that victory is possible. The certainty that sacrifice will mean something. By 1918, these certainties had evaporated. The war had become a weight rather than a mission, a burden rather than a cause. Civilians no longer prayed for victory, they prayed for an end. Soldiers no longer feared the enemy, they feared returning home to cities that had deteriorated into frostbitten warrens of hunger and unrest. A society at war must believe before it can endure. Germany, by late 1918, endured without believing, and that is a condition no nation can survive. The third pillar to fail was political coherence. The German Empire had always been an uncomfortable hybrid, half modern industrial powerhouse, half feudal monarchy with a military aristocratic culture. It worked only as long as discipline held and external conditions remained stable. But war transforms stability into pressure, and pressure exposes every crack. By 1918, the political contradictions of the empire had become unmanageable. The Kaiser was a symbol without gravity. The civilian government issued decrees no one respected. The High Command operated as a parallel state. And the people no longer felt bound to any of them. When sailors mutinied in Kiel, refusing to launch on a final suicide mission, it was not an isolated rebellion, it was a verdict on the monarchy. A verdict on the High Command, a verdict on the entire system that had demanded loyalty while offering suffering in return. Mutiny was followed by protest. Protest by riots. Riots by revolution. Revolution by collapse. The fourth and final pillar to fail was international position. Germany had entered the war with allies. It ended the war alone. The reasons were structural. Austria-Hungary had rotted to its core. Bulgaria surrendered the moment pressure became unbearable. The Ottoman Empire fell apart under the weight of internal revolts and external defeats. Germany did not simply lose allies, it outlived them. And in war, outliving your allies is not a strength, it is a sentence. When Austria-Hungary imploded into a constellation of new nations, Germany lost more than an ally. It lost geographical depth, strategic support, and the last vestige of legitimacy that came from not fighting alone. The Central Powers had become a single power, and that power was exhausted. With the collapse of its alliance system, Germany confronted an impossible reality. It was facing the largest economy in the world, the United States, the largest empire in the world, Britain, and one of the most resilient nations in the world, France, alone. And even then, Germany might have endured, if not for the fifth unwritten pillar of warfare, the will to continue. This was the year the will finally broke, not in a dramatic moment of surrender, but in a gradual vanishing, like fog dissolving when the sun rises. The German soldier did not throw down his rifle out of rebellion. He lowered it because he understood instinctively that something larger than he had already ended. The war continued in form, but not in spirit. A ritual kept going without belief. In his diary, a German corporal wrote in October 1918, "We no longer fear death. We fear pointlessness. This was not cowardice. This was clarity." The armistice that followed was not a negotiation. It was an acknowledgement. Germany did not surrender because it was defeated militarily. Germany surrendered because it had ceased to function as a state. An army cannot fight without food. A nation cannot endure without unity. A government cannot govern without legitimacy. A war cannot continue when the society fighting it dissolves. The final act of Germany's defeat unfolded not in trenches or command rooms, but in the quiet, invisible spaces where societies fracture long before their governments admit it. By the autumn of 1918, the German Empire was not a nation at war. It was a nation unraveling, while the war continued around it like a storm that no longer required wind to destroy. The forces tearing Germany apart were not dramatic in the cinematic sense. They were subtle, cumulative, corrosive. They emerged not from enemy artillery, but from the empire's own exhausted heart. To understand why Germany lost, one must see beyond battles and tactics, beyond offensives and retreats. The truth lies deeper, in the psychological metamorphosis of a society that had carried the unbearable for too long. Empires fall slowly, then all at once, and by 1918, Germany had entered the all at once. The first sign was the silence. Letters from soldiers became sparse, not because censorship prevented them, but because the soldiers no longer had the emotional strength to write. What does one say after 4 years of mud, hunger, disease, and loss? What words remain when language itself feels insufficient to describe the daily erosion of the self? A soldier wrote in his notebook shortly before he disappeared in the Meuse-Argonne fighting, "The enemy is not only across the field, he is within me. He is time." Time, not enemy action, had become Germany's greatest enemy. The German army still functioned as an institution, but its internal cohesion had thinned to a brittle thread. Divisions were nominal. Regiments existed more on paper than in reality. Officers attempted to maintain order through discipline, but discipline cannot resurrect legitimacy. Commands issued from the high command arrived like echoes from a world that no longer existed. The soldiers obeyed, but their obedience came from habit, not conviction. One of the most devastating psychological blows came when the army realized that it could no longer rely on societal support. Soldiers returning on leave found their cities colder, hungrier, more desperate than the front itself. Children scavenged in garbage heaps. Women queued for hours for a loaf of bread that often ran out before they reached the counter. Factories stood silent for lack of coal. The war had consumed the nation's pulse. Many soldiers later admitted that their breaking point was not a bombardment or a wound. It was seeing their families starving while the government insisted victory was still possible. This was not merely a loss of morale. It was the collapse of national trust. And once trust collapses, even a powerful army becomes a hollow instrument. Meanwhile, political cracks widened into canyons. The monarchy lingered like a ghost, visible but irrelevant. The Reichstag demanded peace without the power to enforce it. Hindenburg and Ludendorff issued confidence statements even as their internal memoranda revealed panic. The empire had no unified will. It had competing wills, each trying to survive the collapse in its own way. Workers' councils formed not because of ideology, but because traditional structures had ceased to function. These councils became lifelines in cities where food distribution faltered and public order loosened. Soldiers' councils emerged in garrisons demanding clarity about a war that no longer made sense. These councils were not revolutionary out of ambition, they were revolutionary out of necessity. And then came Kiel. The naval mutiny of late October 1918 was the moment that Germany crossed the point of no return. Sailors refused to launch a final, suicidal sortie that the Admiralty hoped would preserve honor. But honor means little to men who have spent months watching comrades die from influenza, hunger, and hopelessness. The mutiny was not an act of defiance toward the enemy. It was an act of defiance toward a leadership that had lost moral authority. The sailors' refusal spread like a spark across the empire. Hamburg rose, Bremen rose, Munich rose, Berlin trembled. Germany was not conquered. Germany was dissolving. Even the Kaiser sensed the collapse. His speeches, once bombastic, became rambling and defensive. He spoke of loyalty while surrounded by generals who had already abandoned the idea of imperial victory. When he finally fled to the Netherlands, it was not a dramatic abdication, but a quiet withdrawal, the symbolic end of a monarchy that had already died in the hearts of its people. The new government that formed under Prince Max of Baden had no real power, only responsibility. It inherited a war that could not be won and a society that could not endure another day of illusions. When Prince Max handed power to Friedrich Ebert, it was not a transition, it was a confession that the empire had ceased to exist as anything other than a technicality. Meanwhile, at the front, the psychological unraveling accelerated. German units began to surrender in clusters, not out of cowardice, but out of clarity. These were men who understood that survival was not treason, and that dying for a cause already abandoned by its leaders was meaningless. They held the line when they could, retreated when they must, and surrendered when survival outweighed ideology. By late October, Allied commanders remarked that German resistance was still professional, still disciplined, still technically formidable, and yet something essential was missing. That something was the will to sustain a war whose outcome had already been decided not in the trenches, but in the cities, the factories, the farms, and most of all, the minds of the German people. As the Allies advanced, they did not march against an enemy in full defense, they marched against an enemy already preparing to collapse inward. Every kilometer gained by the Allies was a kilometer lost not only on the map, but in the psychological geography of German identity. When the armistice finally arrived, Germany did not collapse the way empires traditionally collapse, with banners falling, citadels stormed, capitals burning. Instead, the empire folded like a tent in the wind. No dramatic battle sealed its fate. No decisive offensive delivered the final blow. The end was administrative, bureaucratic, almost sterile. Germany signed not because it was militarily defeated, but because it had become structurally ungovernable. The paradox of 1918 is one of history's greatest ironies. Germany remained dangerous until the last day, yet had already lost months before the guns fell silent. Its defeat was not a moment, it was a process born from exhaustion, accelerated by hunger, crystallized by political fragmentation, sealed by the collapse of belief. In the final accounting of the First World War, Germany's defeat did not resemble the dramatic collapses of ancient empires or the fiery destructions of later cataclysms. It was not Rome besieged, nor Carthage burned, nor Berlin in ruins. It was something quieter, something more modern, something more revealing about the era that had birthed the conflict. Germany lost the First World War through a collapse that was bureaucratic, economic, psychological, and systemic. A collapse that unfolded not through a single shattering moment, but through a long erosion of the structures that hold a nation together. When the guns fell silent at 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the world expected a clear victor and a clear vanquished. But Germany's defeat was far more complex. It was the end of an old world, but also the beginning of a new world, a world that would inherit not peace, but unresolved tensions, broken societies, and illusions waiting to be exploited. The armistice itself was not a ceremony of triumph. It was an act of exhaustion, a collective exhale from a continent that had become physically and spiritually depleted. German diplomats signed not because their army had been annihilated, but because the state that commanded that army had dissolved into the chaos of revolution. Germany entered the war as an empire. It ended the war as a republic. It would spend the next decades trying to understand what happened in between. What happened was the exposure of a profound truth. Modern war is not won by courage, brilliance, or even tactical mastery, but by the endurance of entire societies. The Germany of 1914 was strong, dynamic, and ambitious, but it had been built for short, decisive wars, not for the endless grind of industrial slaughter. The empire could win battles, it could innovate tactically, it could produce astonishing feats of military coordination, but it could not outlast the world. Once the British blockade choked it, once American industry awakened, once hunger became a national experience, once morale eroded, once allies collapsed, once workers revolted, once the monarchy lost legitimacy, the German war effort became an empty ritual propped up by statistics and illusion. The final blow, in truth, did not fall at the hands of Allied armies. It fell when Germany lost control of its own narrative. Empires live through stories, stories of destiny, sacrifice, victory, divine purpose. But by 1918, Germany no longer believed its own story. What remained was a population that wanted an end, a government that had lost authority, an army that had lost faith, and a war machine that had outgrown the society struggling to feed it. The final months resembled not a military defeat, but a societal implosion. Factories silent, rail lines frozen, red queues unending, families desperate, workers striking, sailors mutinying, politicians panicking, generals blaming, cities trembling, an empire dissolving. When the Kaiser fled to the Netherlands, it symbolized the truth that had been clear for months. Germany was no longer an empire with a leader, but a leaderless society in search of meaning amid devastation. Yet the tragedy did not end with the armistice. It only changed shape. The new Weimar Republic inherited a nation shattered in ways that no treaty could fully address. A starving population, a traumatized army, a bankrupt state, a humiliated political class, a wounded national psyche. Worst of all, Germany inherited the belief, encouraged by generals fearful of accountability, that the army had not been defeated, only stabbed in the back. This myth, poisonous and powerful, emerged from a refusal to acknowledge the real causes of the defeat, the collapse of logistics, morale, unity, and endurance. The stab-in-the-back lie preserved pride at the cost of truth, and thus became the foundation for future catastrophe. The aftermath of defeat revealed something fundamental about the modern age. Industrial war does not simply kill, it transforms the societies that fight it. Germany had entered the war as a rising giant, confident in its science, its industry, its culture, and its destiny. It emerged from the war disoriented, ashamed, divided, and resentful, the psychological soil in which extremism grows like a weed. And yet, within this darkness, another truth appeared. Germany's defeat reshaped Europe, but it also reshaped Germany itself. In failure, the nation confronted realities that had been disguised by imperial rhetoric: the need for democratic structures, economic modernization, social reform, and a political identity not rooted in militarism. These lessons, however, would not be learned easily. They would be contested by millions, exploited by demagogues, weaponized by radicals, and manipulated by a rising movement that promised to restore what had been lost, but would instead plunge the world into a far greater darkness. The First World War destroyed the German Empire. The Second World War would destroy the illusions born from that destruction. But that is another story. The story here ends with a final reflection. A truth spoken not by soldiers or statesmen, but by the war itself. Germany did not lose because it was weak. Germany lost because the war it entered was stronger than any nation could sustain. A war that devoured empires, rewrote borders, erased illusions, and taught the 20th century its first great lesson: that modern conflict is a furnace where nations are not forged, but tested. And those who cannot endure its heat discover too late that victory belongs not to the bold, but to the unbroken. Germany broke. And when it broke, it did not fall alone, but dragged the world into a century defined by the consequences of that fracture. The Great War ended on paper in 1918, but its echoes stretched across decades, across revolutions, depressions, new ideologies, and the next global firestorm. Germany's defeat was not an ending, it was the beginning of the world we inherited.